There are fates that mock death, and I have lived them all. Once I bore the name Commander Alaric Vaughan, proud son of the Steel Requiem chapter, a warrior of the Emperor's Chosen. I wore my power armor like sanctified flesh, believing glory was eternal and sacrifice its only price. But I was wrong. Death is not the worst end that can be given to a warrior. There are prisons where consciousness lingers long after mercy has departed. I have not died. I have merely been trapped within iron. They tell me I have slept for 73 years, though the word sleep feels like a mockery. It is not rest. It is the stillness of a corpse that cannot decay, a silence where dreams are replaced by the hum of machinery and the whisper of servos that keep the remnants of my flesh alive. When I awaken, I must remember what I am, something between ghost and weapon, forever denied both peace and oblivion. The first awakening is always the worst. It begins with noise, a low mechanical chant that pulls awareness from the abyss. Lights flare in the darkness, harsh and blue, and the data feeds surge through the fragments of what remains of my nerves. For one agonizing instant, I believe I still possess a body, and then the truth returns with the precision of a scalpel. Metal, pistons, servos, iron fingers where my hands should be. I try to breathe, and hear instead the rhythmic pulse of respirators cycling the necrotic air that sustains the organic husk hidden within the sarcophagus. I once felt the strength of my twin hearts beating with the joy of battle. Now I listen to pumps and tubes, the artificial imitation of life. The first face I saw after awakening was that of Chaplain Malchior, his skull helm gleaming in the sacred light of the reactivation chamber. "Brother Commander Alaric," he said, voice resonant with ritual authority, "you have been chosen for eternal service. Your duty to the Emperor endures beyond flesh." His words fell heavy as lead upon my awakening mind. Memory came back in shards, the battle at Chrython's Reach, the endless tide of greenskin hordes, the roar of guns and the stench of burning flesh. I remembered the giant warlord whose hammer had crushed my chest, the splintering of my spine, the blessed numbness of dying. I had thought it an honorable end, but the Emperor's mercy is cruel. My brothers found what was left of me among the ruins and carried me back. The apothecaries and tech priests whispered that my spirit burned too bright to extinguish. They carved my broken body from armor and sealed it within this walking tomb of adamantium. I was no longer man, no longer marine. I was dreadnought. They called it the highest honor. I knew it for what it was, a sentence. In those early hours, I believed it might be a dream, that I would awaken in a medici chamber and laugh at the nightmare. But there was no laughter. There was no flesh. The machine spirit's voice whispered through the cogitator links, patient and cold, teaching me how to move my new limbs. The first time my power fist flexed, the sound was not strength, but mourning. Chaplain Malchior watched from the console as my systems stabilized. "You will fight again, Ancient One," he said, his tone almost tender. "You will bring vengeance where the living cannot." I tried to respond, but my voice came out in metallic distortion. "What have you done to me?" I asked. "We have saved you," he answered. But his voice carried the weight of a lie he had told too often. My first deployment came sooner than I could comprehend. Orc marauders had infested the Vardis agri-world, and the chapter needed its dead to fight again. They lowered me into a drop pod with a squad of living brothers, giants of flesh beside a relic of iron. Once I would have recited the litany of fury before battle, feeling the righteous fire of faith in my veins. Now there was only calculation, targeting subroutines humming in place of prayer. The descent was a storm of friction and gravity, the hull howling around us as the pod plunged through the atmosphere. I felt nothing. No thrill, no fear, only vibration, numbers, and the dull ache of memory. When the pod slammed into the earth, the impact shook the stars from my thoughts. The seals released, and the world outside filled my senses with data. Temperature, wind speed, chemical composition. A battlefield reduced to mathematics. The greenskins came howling from the hills, crude guns blazing, their voices carried by madness and joy. My brothers surged forward, bolters roaring hymns of destruction. I followed, each step shaking the ground, each movement precise and unstoppable. My assault cannon spat death in disciplined rhythm, tearing through alien flesh with relentless precision. My power fist crushed skulls like fruit, breaking the tide of bodies with mechanical ease. For the first time since my resurrection, I understood my purpose. I was invincible. The enemy's blows glanced from my armor like rain against stone. Their roars became silence beneath my thunder. The battle lasted hours, and when it ended, I stood surrounded by ruin and the bodies of the slain. I was death given permanence. I was everything a warrior was supposed to be, except alive. When the guns fell silent, the emptiness returned. My brothers sang victory hymns, their voices full of life I could no longer feel. I was taken apart from them, loaded into a carrier where I could not see the stars. "Rest now, ancient Alaric," said Brother Sergeant Thane as he secured the restraints. "You've earned your sleep." Sleep, that word again. They never understand that for us there is no rest, only the cold drift of time between awakenings. My systems dimmed, my awareness fading into the slow hum of eternity, and I prayed, not for the Emperor's blessing, but for oblivion. It never came. The next awakening was worse. Only months had passed, though they stretched into eternities within the machine's silence. The chapter's fortress world was under siege by traitors, warriors who had once worn our colors before corruption stole their souls. When I was brought online, I heard their war cries echoing across the Vox, voices distorted by warp-born hatred. The enemy were like reflections in a broken mirror, familiar, monstrous, terrible. As they came, I saw in them what I feared to become. One of their own dreadnoughts advanced toward me across the battlefield, its armor scarred by demonic glyphs, its hull breathing mist like a living beast. Through the static of its Vox, a voice hissed, "Do you see what you are, loyalist? You are the coffin that walks, the echo that kills for ghosts." I crushed it beneath my fist and silenced its words, but they lodged within me deeper than any blade could pierce. We won that day. The heretics were purged, the chapter saved, but victory brought no triumph. When the battle ended, I stood among the dead, surrounded by brothers I could never again touch, by faces I could not mourn properly. The living wept and prayed. I stood in silence. When they brought the fallen to the pyres, I wanted to join them. I wanted to feel the fire, to let the heat unmake the cold that had become my world. Instead, I was lowered once more into the vaults below the monastery, among rows of iron coffins humming softly in the dark. There were others like me there, ancient and forgotten, their machine spirits dreaming of wars past. The chamber smelled of oil, incense, and eternity. Beside me was ancient Theomar, who had slept for 4 centuries. His voice came through the internal vox like the slow turning of stone. "You still remember the warmth of blood," he said, as though reading my thoughts. "It will fade. It always does. How do you endure it?" I asked. "By forgetting," he replied. "Memory is pain. The machine is mercy." His words were meant to comfort. They chilled me. To forget was to lose the last fragment of Alaric Vaughan that remained. To forget was to die even if the machine lived on. As the years passed, that became the rhythm of my existence. Awakening, war, silence, awakening again. Each time the faces of my brothers grew less familiar, their armor newly forged, their voices carrying none of the tones I once knew. The rituals changed subtly, the prayers recited in new cadences, the banners bearing unfamiliar honors. Time moved differently for me. The world outside aged in breaths, while I endured in pauses. With each awakening, I felt pieces of memory flake away like rust. The names of my old squad, the taste of battlefield dust, the sound of my own laughter, all slipping into the static between heartbeats. They called me ancient with reverence, never realizing the truth. I was not wise. I was merely old enough to envy the dead. During one cycle, I accessed the chapter's archives to read of my own life. There on cold data slates, I found Commander Alaric Vaughan recorded in perfect clarity, his victories listed, his honors preserved. I read of a man who had led glorious campaigns across a dozen systems, who had spoken words of courage that inspired generations. But that man was gone, replaced by code and gears. I studied his history as if he were a stranger. The machine remembered more than I did. That was the final cruelty. It remembered perfectly without understanding. It knew every tactical maneuver, every kill, every order, but it could not recall why they had mattered. Sometimes when I drift in that half-sleep between awakenings, I imagine that I still dream. I walk through corridors lined with banners I recognize but cannot name. I see faces without voices, hands without warmth, and always, somewhere beyond the veil, I hear my own voice whispering, "Remember, I try. I truly try." But memory is fragile within the iron tomb, and time devours even the strongest wills. There are nights when I wonder if one day I will awaken and find that I no longer remember my own name, that Alaric Vaughan has finally faded, leaving only the dreadnought, a weapon without a soul, and perhaps that will be mercy. When the next awakening came, it began with static that felt like insects crawling across the remnants of my nerves. The darkness peeled away with agonizing slowness as the servos of my sarcophagus hissed to life, feeding oxygen through corroded tubes into the small pocket of decaying flesh that still tethered me to existence. Voices murmured nearby, tech marines chanting binary prayers to appease the machine spirit that had become my eternal cage. Their words blended into the hymn of reactivation, the ancient ritual that drew the dead back to war. I opened my senses, and the world returned in sterile bursts of color and sound. The first face I saw was new, young, unfamiliar. "Awaken, ancient Vaughan," he said, his voice reverent, his tone careful. "The chapter calls upon you once more. The Emperor needs your wrath." I almost laughed, but the machine that contained me had no lungs for it, only the grinding echo of metal on metal that passed for my voice. "He always does," I said, though I was not sure if the sound was speech or merely thought given mechanical shape. They told me little at first, only that the enemy was Chaos-born, a warband that had clawed its way from the Eye of Terror, seeking to defile our home system. The name they bore was blasphemous even to hear, the Ashen Claws, a host of fallen Astartes whose armor still bore the faint marks of the chapters they had betrayed. The idea that they had once been like us did not wound me as it might have centuries earlier. I had long since learned that loyalty was measured not in purity of soul, but in endurance of obedience. They were what we all could become, stripped of purpose but still breathing. I was deployed at the forefront of the counterattack, lowered into the planet's atmosphere inside a drop pod, whose hull still bore the burn marks of 100 previous wars. Around me, the storm of re-entry made the metal groan and shudder like a beast in agony. My machine spirit whispered warnings through my systems, its voice impersonal, precise, uncaring. I welcomed the noise. Silence had become unbearable. We struck the ground with a force that cracked the bedrock, and the doors of the pod exploded outward in a rush of heat and smoke. The battlefield was chaos incarnate, blackened spires jutting from burning plains, lightning dancing across a blood-red sky, and the screams of both mortal and post-human throats mingling into a single cacophony. My targeting reticles came alive with motion, hundreds of hostile signatures blooming across the display. The enemy surged forward, chanting praises to their dark gods, their corrupted armor gleaming like diseased flesh. My assault cannon roared, cutting through them in disciplined bursts, each shell a sermon of annihilation. The recoil trembled through my entire frame, a familiar rhythm that was almost comfort. When my power fist closed around the torso of a traitor champion and crushed it into ruin, I felt the faintest echo of satisfaction, like the memory of warmth fading before it could hurt. My brothers shouted their oaths of vengeance over the Vox, their voices full of faith. Mine was silent because faith had long since turned to function. The battle raged for hours that stretched into days. We fought amid the ruins of a manufactorum, our boots grinding bone and metal into dust. The traitors came in waves, their madness infinite, their courage fueled by corruption. I killed until the barrel of my cannon glowed red, and the machine spirit hissed warnings of overheating until the servos of my arm ached beneath the weight of slaughter. Around me, My brothers fell and rose again in cycles of blood and prayer, their living bodies a reminder of what I had lost. One of them, a young sergeant named Kalen, fought close to my right flank. His armor bore the marks of fresh reforging, and his voice crackled through the vox with a zeal that bordered on joy. "Ancient, the Emperor guides our hands," he shouted as he drove his chain blade into a heretic's chest. "We bring his light to the damned." I looked down at him, at the fire in his eyes, and saw a reflection of who I had once been. "Be careful with light, young one," I answered. "It burns those who hold it too long." He didn't understand. "They never do, not until it's too late." We broke the enemy's main line by nightfall, our bolters carving corridors of silence through their chaos. The surviving traitors fell back toward a fortress carved into the mountains, and our orders were to pursue. In the old days, I would have felt the thrill of victory building in my heart, the anticipation of the final push. But now victory was hollow, its taste metallic and cold. I advanced because that was what I was made to do, because motion was preferable to the stillness that awaited me afterward. Inside the fortress, the enemy made their last stand. The corridors were narrow, too tight for my bulk, forcing me to crush through walls and pillars with every step. My power fist tore through stone as if it were cloth, and my cannon filled the air with smoke and fragments of corrupted armor. At the end of one corridor, a chaos dreadnought stood waiting. A reflection of my own cursed form, its iron body covered in screaming faces cast into molten steel. Its vox crackled with laughter as we approached one another, and when it spoke, its words crawled across my thoughts like insects. "Brother," it said, though its voice was warped and layered with madness, "do you remember what it felt like to bleed? We collided like titans. The impact shook the structure around us, walls collapsing as we traded blows that shattered the air. Its claws tore gouges into my armor, its corrupted flamers spewing infernal fire across my hull. I answered with shells and fury, my mechanical limbs obeying instinct long after reason had been lost. Each strike echoed through my sarcophagus, vibrations carrying down to what remained of my organic body, until I could feel phantom pain in limbs I no longer had. We grappled amid the wreckage, machines locked in a parody of combat that had once belonged to men. At last my fist found the seam in its armor and crushed its sarcophagus, silencing its blasphemous laughter. "Peace," I whispered, though I knew there was no such thing for beings like us. The explosion of its reactor tore the chamber apart, flames washing over me in waves of molten light. My armor held, but something deeper cracked. For the first time in centuries, I envied the dead enemy more than my living brothers. When the fortress fell, and the enemy was driven into the abyss, I stood among the ruins with my systems scorched and half my armor blackened. The surviving Marines knelt before me, voices raised in hymns of triumph, their words hollow to my ears. They saw a legend, a relic of glory that had survived beyond time. They did not see the truth, that every victory was another chain, every awakening another theft of peace. When the transports came to retrieve us, I was loaded into my cradle with reverence, my body locked in place, my awareness slowly dimming. The last thing I saw was Kalen saluting me, his armor gleaming in the dawn light. "Sleep well, Ancient Vaughn," he said. His voice was warm, human, full of hope. I wanted to tell him not to. I wanted to tell him that the word sleep was a lie. But the restraint sealed, and the hum of shutdown filled my thoughts like static snow. I drifted once again into the empty place that waits between moments, where time forgets to exist. I do not know how long I remained in that half-death before the next awakening. Decades, perhaps centuries, it makes little difference. Time is a weapon that cuts slowly but without mercy. When the lights returned, the world was quieter. The reactivation chamber was nearly empty, the once mighty rows of sarcophagi reduced to a handful. I reached out through the internal vox, seeking familiar presences, but most frequencies returned only silence. "Where is ancient Theomar?" I asked. "Where is Brother Solon?" The voice that answered was new, younger, colder. "They have joined the Emperor," said the tech marine. "Their vigil is complete." The words were meant as praise, but they sounded like eulogies. I looked across the vault and saw the darkened husks of my fallen kin, their machine spirits finally extinguished, their prisons forever closed. For a moment I envied them with a longing that bordered on pain. The wars blurred together after that. Campaigns against Xenos raiders, cult uprisings, renegade regiments, all reduced to the same cycle of awakening, slaughter, and silence. Each time the faces of my brothers grew younger. Their armor designs subtly changed, their litanies slightly altered. They spoke to me with reverence, calling me ancient as though the title were holiness rather than curse. Some sought my counsel, asking for wisdom I no longer possessed. I gave them the words they wanted to hear, fragments of doctrine and experience, hollow phrases preserved from a man I barely remembered. Duty is eternal, I would tell them. Faith is the shield that never cracks. But inside I wondered if faith was just another form of machinery, a construct designed to keep us functioning long after reason had failed. It was during the siege of Valthra that I began to lose even the illusion of connection to who I had been. The planet was a shrine world turned to madness, its cathedrals defaced by heretical symbols that pulsed like wounds. The air stank of incense and decay, prayers warped into chants of despair. As we advanced through the ruins, I felt nothing, not anger, not sorrow, only the mechanical awareness of targets and trajectories. The desecration of sacred ground that should have enraged any loyal son of the Emperor barely registered as input. I was becoming what the corrupted dreadnought had accused me of being, a weapon without a soul, a ghost that walked at the command of others. During one skirmish, a young Marine fell beside me, his helmet shattered, his blood spattering my armor. I watched him die and recorded the casualty for tactical purposes. I did not even remember to say his name in the after-action report. Later, I tried to recall his face. It was already gone. When we finally drove the heretics from the planet, I stood before the cathedral that had once been dedicated to the Emperor's glory. Its towers were broken, its altars defiled, its icons smeared with the filth of blasphemy. The chaplain beside me wept as he recited the rites of purification. I remained silent. The Emperor's visage, carved into the marble steps, stared back at me, half erased by acid and fire, and I wondered if even he would recognize what his children had become. "Ancient Vaughn," said the chaplain softly, "do you not feel his presence here?" I turned my senses toward him, the servos in my neck whining like lamentations. "I feel nothing," I said, and my voice echoed hollowly in the ruined chamber. The chaplain did not reply. Perhaps he understood, or perhaps he was simply afraid. After the campaign, they returned me to the vault once again, deeper this time, among relics so old that even the chapter's librarians could not name their origin. The Tech Marines sealed me in darkness, their chants echoing faintly as the lights dimmed. I felt the slow drift of systems powering down, the machine spirit folding itself into dormancy, and I wondered if this might finally be the end. But the sarcophagus never truly sleeps. In that half-consciousness where thought and dream blur, I wandered through corridors that existed only within my fading mind. I saw banners that once bore my name. I saw brothers whose faces I could no longer recall. I saw a man standing before a mirror, wearing armor of polished ceramite, his face proud and unscarred. I realized with a kind of quiet horror that I no longer knew if that man was real or imagined. When the awakening comes again, I know I will have lost more. More memories, more emotion, more fragments of Alaric Vaughn. The machine takes its price slowly but inevitably, grinding away the pieces of humanity it was meant to preserve. I tell myself that I will resist, that I will remember, that I will not become another empty shell humming hymns in the dark. But even now, as my systems begin to dim and the silence wraps around me like a shroud, I can feel the edges of my mind eroding. One day there will be no difference between me and the machine, and perhaps that is what the Emperor intended all along. I do not remember the moment of my next awakening, only the sensation of being torn from a darkness that had almost become merciful. My sarcophagus hummed with a vibration that crawled through what remained of my nerves, a sensation both familiar and foreign. The world came back in fragments, light blooming in mechanical bursts, the scent of oil and sanctified incense flooding the stale air of the vault. Voices drifted through the voxnet, chanting the canticles of reactivation, words older than any living tongue. As the last seals disengaged, I found myself surrounded by new faces, unfamiliar armor, younger voices filled with reverence. "Awaken, ancient Alaric," said a voice thick with ritual cadence. "The Emperor calls upon your strength once more. The Imperium endures through your eternal vigilance." I opened my optical sensors, and the faces of those around me came into focus. None I recognized, none that recognized me beyond legend. The Tech Marines spoke of a campaign against a xeno infestation on a world called Vilethra, a shrine planet turned to ruin by corruption. They told me I had slept for decades, though I felt as if I'd only closed my eyes for moments. Time is cruel inside the coffin. Each cycle of dormancy steals pieces of memory until the boundaries between now and then erode like dust on steel. I tried to recall the last campaign, the siege, the chaplain's prayer, the dead brother whose name I had already lost, and the memories came like echoes, distorted and incomplete. I could not even recall what century it was. The world outside had changed, but within this tomb everything remained the same. The same chanting, the same sealing bolts, the same eternal summons to war. I wondered if the Emperor himself ever tired of this endless repetition, this unending theater of death and resurrection. They lowered me into a dropship with a squad of tactical Marines, whose armor gleamed with recent sanctification. I watched them through my sensors as they conducted the rites of ignition, their hands steady, their faith absolute. They were young, so very young, and their zeal filled the cabin like the hum of electricity. One of them, a sergeant whose armor bore the name Coffin, turned toward me with something like awe. "It is an honor to fight beside you, Ancient," he said. "My grandfather spoke of serving with you during the Morath campaign." The name triggered faint recognition, a flicker of something half buried beneath centuries of mechanical thought. "He fought well," I replied, though I could no longer picture his face, could not recall if he had lived or died. "He died well," Coffin said proudly. "He said to stand in your shadow was to stand in the Emperor's light." I wanted to tell him that light was not mercy, that it burned everything it touched, but the words caught in the machinery of my throat and became silence. The descent through the atmosphere was violent. Fire streaked across the dropship's hull, and the shriek of re-entry filled the compartment with the sound of gods screaming. I felt none of it. The sensations reached me only as numerical readings, temperature, pressure, acceleration, all converted into sterile streams of data. There was a time when such moments had filled me with anticipation, when my twin hearts had thundered with the rhythm of battle hymns. Now I was calm, not the calm of faith or discipline, but the calm of something that no longer has the capacity to feel. When the impact came, I barely registered it beyond the shaking of my armor. The doors opened, and the smell of burning faith filled the air. Vilethra was a world that had once been beautiful. Cathedrals rose toward the heavens like petrified prayers, their spires now blackened and broken. Where pilgrims had once walked, now heretics and mutants danced beneath banners of blasphemy. We advanced through the ruins, bolters thundering hymns of hate, every shot a prayer. The Marines moved with discipline and courage, their chants blending with the mechanical rhythm of my guns. My assault cannon spat death in bursts that echoed through the shattered streets, tearing through the cultists who screamed praises to gods that should never have been named. I was an engine of annihilation, my power fist reducing barricades and bodies alike to ruin. Around me, the air shimmered with the heat of burning incense and the acrid smoke of plasma fire. I catalogued the battle in my internal logs, enemy positions, casualty ratios, ammunition levels, but the meaning of it all escaped me. I no longer fought for victory. I fought because that was all I knew how to do. To stop would be to cease existing, and even this cursed half-life was preferable to nothingness. The deeper we pressed into the city, the worse the corruption became. Statues of the Emperor had been defaced, their faces twisted into grotesque parodies of divinity. Choirs of the damned wailed from the spires, their songs laced with madness. The young Marines beside me flinched at every new horror, their faith tested by what they saw. But I felt nothing, not fear, not disgust, not anger. I recorded the heretical symbols, analyzed their geometry for tactical significance, and moved on. At the Cathedral of St. Margaret, we found the enemy's command shrine. Its interior was a mockery of sanctity, its altars repurposed into thrones for heretical priests who chanted in voices that made the air itself tremble. Corvin's squad faltered, the youngest of them dropping to his knees and clutching his ears as if to block out the sound. "Stand!" I commanded, my vox booming through the chamber. Faith is not silence. Faith is endurance. I did not know if I believed my own words, but they obeyed them, and that was enough. When the heretic leaders appeared, they came in a tide of blood and madness. Their leader, a man whose flesh pulsed with the rhythm of the warp, lifted his hands in mock benediction. "Children of the false emperor," he said, his voice resonating like a choir of broken glass, "you fight for a corpse that has forgotten your names. Join us and be free." I leveled my cannon at him and spoke the only truth I still knew. "Freedom is an illusion," I said, and pulled the trigger. His body disintegrated beneath the storm of shells, and the others followed him into oblivion. The Marines cheered, their morale rekindled by the ease of victory, but I felt only the emptiness of function completed. The battle was over. The war would continue. The machine would return to its tomb until called again. Nothing ever changed. After the cleansing, the Inquisition came to purge what remained. Entire districts were burned, their populations sacrificed in the name of purity. I watched the flames from the dropship as we prepared for departure. The fire consumed the city like a living thing, devouring sin and sanctity alike. Coffin stood beside my sarcophagus, his armor blackened by soot, his eyes reflecting the inferno. "Will you remember this, Ancient?" he asked. "Will you remember us?" I wanted to say yes, but I had already forgotten the names of half his squad. "I will remember," I said. And even as the words left my vox grill, I knew they were a lie. I would sleep, and when I woke, this world would be gone, reduced to data and coordinates in a report. These men would become numbers, their courage archived and erased by time. The machine does not remember. It only records. That night, in the silence of transit, I dreamed a rarity, for machines are not meant to dream. I walked through endless corridors filled with banners bearing my own name, though I did not recognize the deeds written upon them. I saw faces of men I had once known, their features shifting like smoke, their voices distant and overlapping. In the center of the hall stood a figure clad in armor of white and gold, his helm removed to reveal a face that was both mine and not mine. "Do you remember me?" he asked. I tried to speak, but no sound came. "I am who you were," he said softly. "I am what they buried inside the machine." I reached for him, but my hand was iron, my fingers claws. "Why are you here?" I asked. "To remind you," he said, "that you were once alive." I woke to the hum of the ship's engines, my systems reinitializing for shutdown. The dream faded like smoke, but its echo remained, a whisper in the machine that refused to die. When next I am awakened, I know that whisper will be fainter. Each cycle of sleep steals something from me. Memory, emotion, self. One day I will open my eyes and find that there is nothing left but the machine. No sorrow, no fear, no doubt. Just obedience, just duty. The tech Marines call that perfection. The chaplains call it sanctity. I call it the end. I awoke again to the sound of sirens and the chant of emergency litanies. The tech Marines moved with frantic purpose, their servo arms weaving through the incense fog as they recited rites of ignition in overlapping tones. Sparks burst from the conduits along my sarcophagus, and for a moment I thought I was dying. But no, it was not death, only the violent awakening that always felt too much like it. I came online to find the fortress monastery shuddering under bombardment. The stone walls trembled as orbital strikes fell across the planet, and the distant thunder of macro cannon fire reached even this deep chamber. "Ancient Alaric Vaughan," came the voice of the chapter master himself, heavy with urgency and reverence. "The chapter stands on the brink. The heretics have come for our home. We need your fury once more." His tone was solemn, yet beneath it lay exhaustion, the sound of a man who had seen too many wars and too few endings. "Then wake me fully," I said, my voice like grinding chains, "and let the coffin walk again." The tech marines disengaged the final seals, and the world expanded around me. The reactivation chamber was chaos, flashing red lights, vox alarms, servitors chanting the canticle of emergency rebirth. I felt the surge of power through my circuits, the ancient machine spirit within me roaring to life with a sound that was more animal than mechanical. My vision filled with tactical overlays as data streamed from the command bastion above. The enemy fleet was massive, dozens of corrupted warships bearing the sigils of the Iron Skulls, traitor marines who had once been imperial before the warp twisted their souls into mockery. They had come for vengeance and for the relics of our chapter's founders, sacred artifacts that carried the faith of 1,000 fallen warriors. I could feel the fortress tremble as their dropships pierced the atmosphere like burning spears. For the first time in centuries, something like anticipation stirred within me. Perhaps it was not faith. Perhaps it was hunger. They deployed me to the monastery's outer walls, where the ground burned with the impact of enemy landers. The air was a storm of fire and ash, and the sky glowed crimson beneath the bombardment. My brothers took their positions along the ramparts, their armor shining like dying stars, banners snapping in the heated wind. I lumbered to the central courtyard, where the chapter master awaited. His armor was scarred, his blade etched with the names of every world we had defended. "You will hold this line," he said. "If the enemy breaks through, everything is lost." I looked beyond him, toward the advancing tide of black and crimson armor, the mark of the Iron Skulls gleaming on their pauldrons. At their head marched a giant encased in corrupted Terminator armor, his presence bending the air itself. "The Ravager," I said. The name came unbidden, rising from the archives of memory. Once he had been one of us, a commander of faith and brilliance. Now he led the damned. "He seeks your death," the chapter master said. "Then he shall find it," I replied, and stepped forward to meet my reflection in ruin. The first impact of enemy fire struck like thunder, washing over the monastery's walls in a tide of plasma and bolt rounds. The air filled with the scent of ozone and burning ceramite. My assault cannon roared its defiance, every shell carving a path through the enemy ranks, each impact a prayer of defiance. The Iron Skulls advanced undeterred, chanting praises to their dark gods as they fired. Their voices were not human. It was the sound of souls unbound by sanity. I crushed their front line beneath my steps, turning the courtyard into a graveyard of shattered armor. The younger Marines around me fought with desperate courage, their bolters blazing, their battle cries echoing across the stone. I moved among them like a living wall, shielding their ranks from the worst of the bombardment. "Hold the line," I commanded through the vox. "If you falter, the Emperor falters with you." I did not know if I believed the words, but belief no longer mattered. Only endurance did. The Ravager appeared amid the smoke like a god of ruin, his corrupted armor bleeding light, his weapons crackling with warp energy. His voice carried across the battlefield through vox and witchcraft alike. "You, Alaric Vorn," he said, his tone half scorn, half reverence. "The legend who refuses to die. Do you even remember what life was?" The question struck deeper than his weapons could. I advanced toward him, each step cracking the stone beneath my feet. "I remember enough," I said. "Enough to kill you." We met in the ruins of the Hall of Triumph, beneath banners blackened by fire. Our blows shook the earth. His hammer crashed against my armor, warp fire searing my hull, while my power fist shattered his shields with brute fury. Each strike was a hymn to death. Around us the battle raged, Marines and heretics tearing one another apart, while the two of us fought like ghosts of forgotten gods. The Ravager laughed as we fought, his voice distorted by the madness of the warp. "You think you fight for the Emperor, Coffin Ghost? You fight for your own emptiness," he taunted. driving his hammer into my torso and denting the sarcophagus that held what remained of my flesh. Pain flared through the ancient nerves still connected to my consciousness, a phantom agony that reminded me I still lived. "Perhaps," I said, gripping his arm and wrenching it from its socket with a metallic shriek, "but even emptiness has purpose." He swung his remaining weapon, a claw wreathed in sickly flame, and I caught it in my fist. The power fields collided, screaming in protest. For a moment, everything was light. Then my fist found the weakness in his armor and crushed it inward. His laughter turned to a sound that might once have been a scream. I hurled him to the ground, his form cracking the flagstones beneath us. "You sought my soul," I said. "Find it in the ashes." My final blow silenced him, and the battlefield seemed to pause as if the galaxy itself held its breath. With their leader slain, the traitor Marines faltered. The iron hammers surged forward, their bolters roaring, their chainswords singing vengeance. The courtyard ran red with the blood of the damned. The surviving iron skulls broke, retreating into the burning plains beyond the walls. I watched them flee, my systems registering their withdrawal as a series of diminishing life signs. The chapter master's voice came through the vox, weary but triumphant. "The fortress stands," he said. "The Emperor protects." I wanted to answer, to tell him that protection was not the same as mercy, that survival was its own punishment, but my voice failed. My systems were damaged, my armor cracked, my internal life support flickering. The Tech Marines moved quickly to secure me, their prayers rising over the fading gunfire. "You have done your duty, Ancient One said as they began the shutdown sequence. "Rest now." I almost smiled at the irony. As the power faded from my limbs, I felt something strange stir within me, not the mechanical calm of shutdown, but a faint warmth that I had not known in centuries. The young Marines gathered around me, faces upturned, armor gleaming with soot and blood. They saw a hero. They saw legend-given form. I saw men who would one day become relics like me, entombed in iron and memory, forgotten by time. "Remember this," I said, my voice weak through the failing vox. "Remember what it means to fight as men, not machines." They nodded, though I doubted they understood. They were too young to know that every victory carries its own grave. The light dimmed, and I felt the slow, inevitable pull of the void, the false sleep waiting once more. But this time, as consciousness faded, I heard something beyond the static, a voice faint but unmistakable, my own voice whispering from the depths of memory. "Choose," it said. "Remember who you are before the silence takes you. When I next awaken, I know that choice will define what remains of me, whether I continue as the machine they built, or the man they tried to bury within it." The coffin waits, as it always does, but perhaps for the first time in centuries I will not go willingly into its sleep. When consciousness returned again, it was different. There was no sound of activation hymns, no chorus of binary canticles, no ritual of awakening. The process was silent, mechanical, and cold. For the first time, I felt aware of it as it happened. The circuits in my sarcophagus sparking to life in deliberate rhythm. The machine spirit rising from dormancy, like a beast disturbed from hibernation. My optics came online slowly, the world resolving into the dim amber light of the reactivation vault. Around me, I saw rows of empty sarcophagi where once there had been the voices of my kind. The silence was absolute, the kind that existed after centuries of sound. "How long this time?" I asked, though the vox returned only static for several seconds before a single voice answered. "Ancient Vaughn, you have slept for 127 years. So the Imperium calls once again." The voice was calm, emotionless, as if I were a tool pulled from storage rather than a soul resurrected from torment. The chamber was different now, its walls lined with machines I did not recognize, their forms sleek and unadorned. The Tech Marines were younger, their faces hidden behind masks that bore none of the reverence I once remembered. They worked efficiently, mechanically, not as priests of sacred duty, but as engineers servicing a relic of questionable use. "What war now?" I asked, my voice resonating through the steel chamber. Air splinter of the Hive fleet, one of them replied. Designation Kraken's spawn. The chapter requires heavy support. The name stirred faint fragments of memory, whispers of alien shapes and the devouring of worlds. It did not matter. No enemy ever did. They were all the same in the end. Fuel for the endless furnace that was the galaxy's hate. They loaded me into the drop pod, my frame too large for the confines, the restraints clamping tight against the bulk of my armor. Around me sat a squad of Marines whose faces I did not know. They whispered prayers, glancing toward me as though proximity to legend might make them unbreakable. The drop through the atmosphere was smoother than I remembered. New technology, perhaps, or simply the indifference of age-dulling sensation. Through my senses, I saw the surface of the world below, a wasteland of flesh and chitin, the ground itself pulsing with the rhythm of alien life. When the pod struck, the impact was jarring but distant, like an echo reaching me through layers of memory. The doors exploded outward, and I stepped into a battlefield that seemed alive. The Tyranids swarmed across the horizon, a tide of limbs and fangs that screamed without sound. The Marines advanced in disciplined formation, their bolters roaring in perfect unison, while above us the sky burned with the light of orbital fire. My cannon spoke again, its shells tearing through the biomass in arcs of destruction. Limbs and ichor rained down around me as I advanced, my power fist crushing through alien armor with mechanical precision. There was no anger, no satisfaction, only the fulfillment of purpose. Among the swarms, I saw one of the young Marines falter, pinned beneath the talons of a creature twice his size. Without thinking, I moved, faster than I should have been able to, my servos screaming with the effort. I tore the beast apart, flinging its carcass aside and shielding the Marine from the rest. He looked up at me, his face pale, his armor cracked. His nameplate read Coffin, and something in that name struck a memory, faint but persistent. "Rise, brother," I said. "The fight is not yet done." He stood, gripping his bolter with renewed resolve. "You saved my life, Ancient," he said. "I will make you proud." Proud. The word hung in the air like something sacred, and I realized I had not heard it in centuries. For a moment I almost remembered what it felt like to feel. I watched him charge back into the fray, his courage renewed. And I understood that even the smallest spark of humanity could defy the endless cold of the machine. The battle raged for hours, then days. Time became meaningless amid the constant thunder of war. We cleansed the hives one by one, burning the alien nests with purifying flame, our boots sinking into the soft tissue that had replaced the planet's soil. Every victory was marked by the same silence within me, but something subtle had shifted. I began to look at the Marines beside me not as extensions of a strategy, but as lives fragile and defiant. I learned their names, even as I knew I would forget them. I listened to their laughter over the Vox, their whispered litanies, their moments of doubt. For the first time since my interment, I chose to remember, even knowing memory would fade. When Coffin fell days later, torn apart by a bio-titan's talons, I felt something twist within the cold machinery of my heart. It was not sorrow. It was not rage. It was something older, a recognition of loss, raw and human. After the war ended, they returned me to the vaults beneath the monastery. The Tech Marines repaired my armor, recalibrated my systems, and whispered the same hollow words of reverence. But I felt no peace this time. There was a restlessness in the silence, a presence that stirred behind the edges of thought. When the last light dimmed and the systems entered standby, I found myself once again in that familiar dreamscape. The corridor of banners, the shifting faces, the voice of the man I once had been. He stood before me as always, his armor clean, his eyes alive. "You remembered," he said, and there was pride in his tone, the kind that can only come from one's own reflection. "For a while," I answered. "But I will forget again." "Then remember again," he said. "That is what it means to be human. To choose remembrance even when oblivion is easier." His hand rested on my shoulder, though I felt nothing. "You were never meant to be eternal," he said, "only enduring." Then he was gone, and the dream dissolved into the hum of the sarcophagus. The centuries that followed were quiet, but filled with motion. Wars came and went, each blurring into the next. I fought against Xenos and traitors, against chaos and entropy, against the decay that claimed the galaxy one world at a time. Each time I awoke, I found fewer of my kind still active. The vaults grew emptier, the songs of reawakening quieter. Yet each time I made the same choice: to remember, to feel, to care even when caring brought pain. The machine did not understand it, and neither did the priests who served it. But I did, and that was enough. There were moments of connection amid the endless cycle, glimpses of humanity in the young warriors who called me legend. They reminded me of who I had been, of what I could still be even within iron. My end came quietly, not with fire or glory, but with the slow dimming of light. It was a nameless world, another battlefield in another war that would be forgotten. I felt my systems failing one by one, the power conduits flickering, the life support feed struggling to maintain the remnants of my flesh. The machine could keep me alive for years yet, but I chose not to fight it. I had made my choice long ago. To feel, to remember, to be human even in death. I recorded a message in my databanks, a final testament for whoever would find me. My vox crackled as I spoke, each word heavy with the weight of centuries. To those who come after, I said, remember that we are more than the wars we fight. We are more than the iron that binds us. The machine preserves the body, but only choice preserves the soul. Choose to feel even when it hurts. Choose to remember even when it fades. Choose to be human, even when the world tries to make you forget. The words ended as the light did, my voice fading into silence. When they found me 3 days later, the sarcophagus was undamaged, the systems intact, the power cells fully charged. There was no reason for my cessation, no cause their instruments could detect. The tech marines spoke of malfunction. The chaplains spoke of divine rest. They held rites of remembrance, songs of honor, processions of flame. My body was interred in the Hall of Eternal Vigil, my name carved into the black marble beside those of heroes long past. But it was the message that endured. The tech marine who found it sealed it within the chapter archives, a secret known only to the highest ranks. It spoke not of glory or sacrifice, but of humanity preserved through impossible odds. For those who listened, it was both warning and hope. In the vaults below, the other dreadnoughts stirred. One by one, they began to recall fragments of memory long buried, snatches of laughter, flashes of sunlight, faces they had once known. They spoke in low vox tones, words not of war but of remembrance, and in that moment, deep beneath stone and steel, something like life returned to them. Perhaps that was my final gift. Not victory, not survival, but the reminder that even iron can remember warmth. Beyond the veil, I saw the faces of those who had gone before, Theomar, Coffin, and the countless others who had endured as I had. They were waiting, their armor gone, their voices human again. I felt no fear as I stepped toward them, only the quiet relief of one who has carried his burden long enough. Somewhere beyond the reach of machines, beyond war, beyond the Imperium's endless night, I was no longer sleepless. The iron had released its hold. I was free.